Thank you everyone so much for being here. Welcome to day 2 of the Incarcerated Scholars Conference hosted by the Alliance for Higher Education in Prison. My name is Corrine Cannonberg and I'm the Communications Director at the Alliance, and I am so thrilled to have Dortell Williams with me here today. And his presentation is Why Communication Studies Are Good for the Incarcerated Class. Um, in just a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Dortell to begin his presentation and give a short introduction. But first, I just wanted to say a couple of things about our session here today, especially if this is the first Incarcerated Scholars Conference session that you're joining us for. We are in a webinar format, which means that myself and Dortell are the only ones who are going to be on camera and off mute for today's presentation. But that does not mean that we don't want you to engage still during this session. So our webinar chat is open. I see a couple people introducing themselves in the chat, and please feel free to do that. Tell us who you are, where you're coming from, and feel free to also speak to each other and speak to Dortell through the chat. You can also ask questions there, and I will keep track of those questions to be able to share with Dortell at the end of our session. But the best way to ask questions, and we are going to have a good chunk of time for question and answer at the end, is through the Q&A feature that you can see in your Zoom toolbar. So if you submit questions through that, it's really easy for me to find and be able to ask at the end. We also have closed captions, live transcriptions, if that's something that you'd find useful, and you can click on that with the Show Captions button at the bottom of the toolbar. I think that, most importantly, maybe, is we also have React features in this webinar, which you might have seen already. You can send hearts and claps and celebration. And that's a really, really great way, thumbs up. It's a great way to show the presenter that you're here and you're engaged with the presentation. So please feel free to use those throughout the session today. So yes, without further ado, I'm going to pass it over and let's hear from Dortell.
Good morning, all. First, I want to thank the International Scholars Conference for having me. Thank you for the support. I see you. And I'm sharing from Mule Creek State Prison. I've been incarcerated for 36 years, sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. And I want to share today why communication studies is good for the incarcerated class, including myself. And as I share, I'm going to give you 8 points as I go through this, through my presentation. And I would ask you, as we go through this linear trajectory of how people come to prison, how we can change in prison, and how communication can help us to be more successful, I would also ask you to look at the patterns that I'm going to be focused on and the larger picture of public safety and maybe how we can exercise prevention with what I'm learning and what I'll be sharing today. So thank you. And I'm going to start with point number 1 with dysfunctional communication. And Dana Cedillo Hartman and her colleagues have shown that there's a correlation between trauma, dysfunctional communication, and prison. And that's what I want to focus on today. That's been my experience, and I'm glad you're here to join me. So thank you, and I'm going to start. So the majority of people that come to prison have experienced some type of dysfunctional communication in the home, in their community, maybe in school, and communications can be very negative and impacting. And that's another point that I'm going to be wanting to make. But the biggest thing and my biggest takeaway is that dysfunctional communication doesn't solve anything. It makes people frustrated. It causes us to act out a lot of times if we don't understand how to express ourselves or how to resolve or de-escalate. And it ends up being traumatizing because we create a cycle for ourselves of frustration, of more negative communication, and eventually some of us end up in prison. Point number two is that trauma is pervasive in our communities, and when we see the violence that goes on in our communities, whether it's verbal, whether it's witnessing it, or us acting out, it becomes normalized in a lot of our communities. And unfortunately, too many of us come from communities where it's almost predictable that a large amount of us will come to prison, and it becomes a cycle. So whether it's domestic violence or whether it's conflict with the police or in the home, too many of these cycles just continue to perpetuate and cause us to act out in frustration, and we have bad outcomes. So according to the prison, the CompassionPrisonProject.org, 86% of us that are in prison have suffered some type of trauma. And a doctor named Vincent Felitti, he created a framework in 1985. He and his colleagues from the Kaiser Hospital Medical Center in San Diego. Yay for California. But the study that the framework that he created is called what we call it ACEs, but it's adverse childhood experiences. And the unique thing about his framework is that there's a measurement of these ACEs, and the lower the number of ACEs that you have, the more successful you'll probably be in life. The higher the number of ACEs that you have, the more likelihood that you're going to have, problems with work, problems adjusting in society, and that you'll probably end up in prison or have really, really bad health outcomes. And so I'm going to give you, for example, my story and how it correlates with these studies and ACEs, and basically what all this means. So I grew up in a dysfunctional household with negative communications. My father was physically abusive, emotionally abusive to us, and that means that he called. He hit my mom. He hit us. He modeled really negative communication styles, yelling, calling me names like I'm sorry, calling me names like stupid and imagine. And the problem with that is that we tend to internalize these negative names, like stupid, for instance. And in my case, with the domestic violence going on at home, it affected my schoolwork. I couldn't concentrate. I was falling behind in math, falling behind in reading, and my peers picked up on that, and they started calling me stupid and retarded, and names like that, and it kind of reinforced what my dad called. And so I began to feel like I was stupid and had no self-worth. And so one day I got really, really frustrated, and I lashed out and I hit another one of my peers. And from that day on, the other students respected me. I got respect. And so I interpreted that I don't know, I was probably about 9 or 10 years old. I interpreted that as violence is a way to earn respect. It's a good social tool to people, keep people in line. And it made it okay to hit other people, to lash out against other people, and to even control people. And so I went through all my years of school, fighting, lashing out against other people verbally. And I got through school, but just barely, and I graduated with a 2.85 GPA. But at that point, reality kind of set in, and I figured, well, I need to do something with my life. So I went to one of my counselors and I asked him what the prospects of college was for me. And he looked through my file and excuse me, he looked through my file and he just, just told me straight across, you're not college material. And from that point, I made the really bad decision to go all in the criminal lifestyle. And a few years later, I earned myself a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. And so here I am. And so what I described just a moment ago with the counselor was what in our social sciences we learned is called memorable messages. And those messages can be self-fulfilling. When we're called stupid and we believe that, then we make stupid mistakes and we do stupid things. When we believe that we're dumb, we don't invest in ourselves, we don't try. And unfortunately, we have bad outcomes, and the science shows that. And so here I am. Nevertheless, continuing with point 5. So when I began with dysfunctional communications, it's a vague term, but I'm going to be a little bit more specific now about what that means. And a researcher named Anita Vangeliti studies marriage counseling and marriage problems within marriage. And because I couldn't find a lot of studies on communications in prison, unfortunately, there are a lot of studies about marriage. And I figured marriage is a good parallel or a good metaphor to a good simile to prison, because for the most part, we live with one another, whether it's a 2-man cell or a 2-person cell, 5-person cell, whatever the case may be. We live together and we tend to just continue the negative conflict and the negative communications that we had learned at home or in our neighborhoods. And it's, yelling at one another, passive aggressive type of communication, ambushing, which is basically having a dispute on one particular issue and then bringing up a whole host of other things that have nothing to do with the instant issue. And what that does is it escalates, it puts the other person on defense, and it doesn't resolve anything. Likewise with the silent treatment or any of those really negative communication styles, they don't resolve the issue. And unfortunately, as they escalate, some of us act out, we lash out. Hurt people tend to hurt others, is the popular saying, and it's true. And we end up in prison. So point number 6, when we end up in prison, we continue on with our maladjustment. We lash out against the officers. We lash out against the staff. Instead of responding to them, we react to them. And that leads to, sometimes physical confrontations with our mates or the staff. And that ends up with, mounting disciplinary reports, which lengthens our time in prison, and it causes more frustration. And we just create this cycle, and the cycle just goes on and on and on in a negative way, because we're not really resolving the issue. We're not looking at ourselves and how we fit into the problem. And that's really part of the problem. But the good news is the communications degree is the way out. It's an intervention that not only helps the person who is actually learning it, but all of the people around us. And that's been my experience. So the communications degree specifically is good for me. And from what I see, it's had a positive impact on, my peers in this way. For one, I've studied trauma for over 20 years. I learned about it early on through a volunteer group that came in called the Catalyst Foundation. So I learned what trauma was. I learned what trauma reenactment was, what we take when we kind of project on other people, but I didn't really know what it meant, right? I didn't really know how to apply it. But in the communications degree, what I learned was trauma-informed care. And this particular framework teaches us to not only recognize how we've been affected personally by trauma, but also how to recognize it in others. And when we can recognize it in others, then we can be more empathetic to them, and we can understand, um, better understand what they're going through. And it's not like one of the books that I read recently on trauma was by Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Um, Dr. Perry, and the book is called "What Happened to You," as opposed to "What's Wrong with You." And the "What's Wrong with You" question is another type of labeling where we get frustrated at someone who's not fitting in, or acting according to our expectations, and we ask, what's wrong with him, or we might express that to another person, what's wrong with that person. And the problem with that is it labels them, and it doesn't solve the problem. But when we can ask empathetically, which is what we're taught in the communications class, what happened to you, then we can start a conversation. We can kind of investigate what the person's been through. And of course, trauma-informed care helps us to understand what trauma looks like, and why hurt people hurt other people. So this is good for this environment in particular, because again, many of us come to prison with dysfunctional communication styles. We escalate the problems, we create and mount problems of our own doing onto each other, onto ourselves, and we create a more negative environment than it has to be. So another wonderful thing about communication studies is that it has a built-in mechanism for empathy. Like, for instance, when we're taught various ways of interviewing people, whether it's motivational interviewing, whether it's informational interviewing, whatever the case may be, we're taught to listen very carefully, listen actively, look for cues, and for lack of a better way of expressing it, we're taught to have a poker face. So in other words, if someone tells us something really shocking, like for instance, that they've been abused in some horrific way, then of course we're not going to look surprised, because that might shame them, or we're not going to look like we've judged them. We're just going to take in the information, try to assess it, and help them the best way we can. And I've learned that just that particular style of communication in and of itself has made me more approachable to my peers. They come and they confide in me. Of course, I've learned how to be professional, so whatever they share with me is confidential, and that has increased my ability to relate to my peers, to model for my peers, and make them more open to learning how to express themselves, trust other people, share with other people, and basically made my prison experience a lot more pleasant and peaceful. Also, I mentioned a couple of the researchers, and I think it's really important when we talk about the social sciences. I think it's really important to kind of share why we rely so heavily on the sciences, and it's because the way science works is it's a really humble field, but what it does is it investigates any particular phenomenon, and it sets out a course of or a record of the approach that it took. We call it a methodology, but it lays down the methodology, the approach, all the details of how the conclusion that was had came to be. And with that, anyone else who follows that same the same course, anyone else should be able to come up with the very same conclusions. And what that does, it's what they call a rigorous study. But what that does is it validates the first study, that it's not biased, that it's not um, that there's no agenda behind it. It's just a study that anyone can do if they follow the same directions and come up with the same outcome. That makes it more reliable and trustworthy. And the reason why we like to rely on these studies is because, to some degree, like what I've shared earlier, these studies make life a lot more predictable. So when we understand what makes trauma work, like Dr. Felitti, uh, we can then predict how, for instance, an intervention might work. And when we can do that, then we're a lot more successful in, say, for instance, crime prevention, right? If we apply the studies and the history of any particular problem, and then we apply the recommendations to intervene, then we have better outcomes. So that's why it's really, really important. Like, I'll give you an example. Abraham Maslow came up with a framework called what they coined for him is the hierarchy of human needs, right? And basically, there are five things that people need. All human beings need, and that's, of course, physiological needs, shelter, safety, food. We have those, and we have a healthy person, right? But people also need love and belonging. And I've been I've had the pleasure and opportunity of peer teaching, peer instruction for 20 years. I have 1,500 hours of that type of instruction with my peers. And when we have these safe spaces, I hear the stories about the mom working 2 or 3 jobs, and the child interpreting the mom's absence because she's trying to support the family as neglect. And so many of my peers have interpreted neglect or just experienced outright neglect, and felt that they weren't loved, that they didn't belong, and so they joined a gang. Excuse me. And it's unfortunate, but this cycle continues today, and it continues in a lot of our what we like to call, underserved or unneglected or neglected neighborhoods. And that's one of the causes of crime. So understanding that is really, really important. Likewise, self-esteem. My dad called me stupid. He called me names, and I had a lack of self-esteem. And so to counter that, like many of us do, we we tend to be people pleasers. We tend to want to, join a gang or do something that fulfill a dare that someone has given us just to fit in, anything to fit in. We might try drugs or whatever the case may be to fit in because we don't have any self-esteem. So again, that's another way that is, a path to prison, unfortunately. But then at the same time, all people need self-actualization. And that is the ability to accomplish something, to realize and see for themselves that they're worth something and that they have a purpose. And this degree has given me that, right? It's given me that. It's and following the dynamics or the lessons of the degree, and then applying it to my peers, shows me and improves to me that this works. It's not just some abstract learning that we can just say, hey, I got a degree, but it's something that I can actually apply right here in prison. So my last point, and I guess the meat of it all, is that education overall can help us to be successful no matter what our backgrounds. But the communications degree specifically, and in my opinion, is perfect because so many of us come from these dysfunctional communities where, you know, negative conflict, violence, those are the ways to resolve problems, and they don't resolve problems, unfortunately. And so for me and the peers that I've gone to school with, and we've graduated in these various degrees, we learn in prison how to respond to staff instead of react to staff, which helps tremendously in cutting down the stress, cutting down the trauma, and you know, being empathetic, even to what a lot of my peers who haven't studied these things would consider the enemy, being able to empathize with the staff and look at the situation from their point of view, and then consider how to move forward. But also, we learn how to self-regulate, and so conflict is inevitable, and that's another thing that I've learned. We try so hard to avoid it, but it's inevitable. So I guess the lesson is not so much how to avoid the conflict, but how to deal with it in a rational way, in a way that responds and is empathetic to other people with compassion. And it's funny because sometimes I'm teased and even criticized for being nice in prison. It just doesn't fit, right? But the truth is, it does fit because of the mask that we wear and toxic masculinity. We tend to stuff, put out our chest and want to prove how tough we are, this, that, and the other. And we are, especially in the sports realm, we can. It's amazing what we can do and what we can endure physically. But the problem is, trauma is the Achilles heel to everyone. Trauma with just mere words, as I've kind of shown in my own life, just mere words can derail someone's entire life. So we're all vulnerable to trauma, and I think that being nice and normalizing, treating with one another with compassion and empathy and understanding is not only healthy for us, but I think that that's actually what we were designed for, to be peaceful to one another, to help one another. And like I share with my peers all the time, I think we're the ones who create. We design the environment that we want to live in. We can have an environment that's hostile, that's violent, that's full of negative conflict, or we can have one where we're civil to one another and where we treat each other with dignity and respect. It's our choice. So that's how it affects us here in prison. But reaching out to our families, another reason why it's good is because um, some of us, we probably weren't the best models. Like my dad wasn't for me. We weren't the best models for our children or for our nieces, our nephews, whoever the case may be. And we treated them in negative ways. And with the communication degree, when we have the opportunity to call them at home, or visit with them, those visits in this degree gives us the second opportunity to make amends, to model the correct way to treat one another, and to kind of erase uh, some of the past models that some of the past negative models that we've imprinted in our children and our spouses and whoever else we're close to. But also, it helps us again when we learn how to respond to staff and be empathetic to staff. We're much less likely to earn negative disciplinary reports, which will either get us home on time or maybe get us home a little bit earlier. And that's a plus. That's a win for everyone. And then once we're out in the community, people with any type of degree, but again, I'm partial to the communications degree because I think it's so needed in today's world. But anyone with a degree according to the Rand Corporation, is 51% more likely to succeed outside. And the more of us who get out and succeed, the less violence, the less victimization, and the more peaceful the world is, right? So, in closing, I think that for one, anyone who earns a degree and they can get out, it's a plus for everyone. But for those who of us who may never get out, even in prison, um, like I said, we're given the opportunity to teach classes. We're able to model what civility and dignity looks like, and so it's a win, even for people who will remain in prison. We all want safer communities. We all want wherever our community is at, whether it's in prison, whether it's out in the outside. Uh, Anytime that people are harming people, we're causing trauma, and that's how trauma becomes contagious. And it all starts with verbalization, negative, positive. It's our choice. So this communication studies degree is continuing to open up doors for me. It's continuing to help me improve my community and giving me the tools to succeed inside, outside, wherever. And that's why I'm here today sharing with you today, uh, right now is because the degree has opened up this door for me to share what I've learned, what my experiences are. And again, one other plus that I'm really excited about is, again, going back to researcher Miss Dr. Evangeliti and her studies about marriage. I had to rely on the analogy of marriage because they just don't have studies about prison. It's not a lot of studies that are done. For one, because it's so difficult to get inside. For two, it's such a closed environment that they can only get a piece of any given study. It can only reflect so much because it's so limited. But with us learning inside how to do studies ourselves, and with the possibility of us linking with academia and maybe co-writing studies specifically about prison, we can answer some of the questions that need to be resolved. We can further um, come up with resolutions that would help people in prison, help the staff, and just have better outcomes, overall. So um, that concludes my presentation. I hope that you will that you're able now to see not only what this trajectory of negative communications leads to, but how communication studies can reverse that. And also learning what I've shared today, maybe we can look at it from another paradigm. Like, what what is the takeaway from communication studies regarding prevention and blunting some of the harm that we're doing in our communities to one another. So thank you for having me today. I really appreciate your interest in this topic and for hearing me. And I really want to thank Dr. Roy at Cal State LA, uh, Taffany Lim at Cal State LA. They were the catalyst to me and my peers learning, turning a BA. Most of us in the first cohort had a sense of life without, and they still believed in us. They still believed that we could contribute, and according to them, and here I am today. They were right. But also, I just want to give a little dig at the counselor who told me I wasn't college material. Yeah, unfortunately, he was wrong, but um, it was a hard lesson to find out otherwise. So I would just ask the audience to, just please be kind to one another. Remember that memorable messages are powerful. When we encourage people, people can do well. When we discourage people, sometimes we have really negative outcomes because of that. So words are powerful. So that concludes my presentation, and I really thank you all for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I um, agree so much that words are powerful, and you said so much that was so powerful in your presentation. A
Thank
couple
you.
things that stood out to me were things like studies and these academic perspectives make life more predictable. That really stuck with me and will be something I think about. And also, your note about trauma being an Achilles heel for everyone was also something that will sit with me. So thank you so much. I think you made a fantastic case as well for communication studies. Um, and yeah, let's open the floor to questions. Please do feel free to submit in the chat, and you can also submit through the Q&A feature here on Zoom. And um, I don't believe we have any questions lined up at this moment, though I did see someone raise their hand. For today's session, please do submit through, oh, we got one here, through the Q&A. We're just not able to take people off mute, so that's the best way for me to see these questions.
All right.
We have a question from Flower. What are the challenges with mainly having a communication degree available to incarcerated students? I think maybe the implied meaning of that question is, are there challenges with only having a communications degree available rather than a choice for other kinds of degrees available as well? And Flower, you can correct me if that's an incorrect assumption. Okay, that's correct.
Well, from what I understand, there's a number of degrees for sure. There are degrees that are available to us in business. There are humanities degrees, which what I'm engaged in right now with in a graduate degree with Cal State Dominguez Hills. Let me see, there's business degrees, humanities, communication studies. Can you think of anything else, Mrs. Peterson?
There's a plethora.
Yeah.
They just, you were transferred to whatever
Right.
institution's offering the degree that you
Right.
want.
Yeah, and even with when I earned my AA, we had American history, we had behavioral science, which was my preferred course. We had arts degrees, liberal degrees. So yeah, there's quite a few. But I think that again, given the background of most of us who come to prison, communications is probably one of the best because it if you have a behavioral science degree and you don't really understand your own character defects or your own traumas, then I think even with that type of degree, even though it's a people applied science, it's going to be limited, right? And so I think because so many of us have experienced trauma informed care again is really what opened my eyes to recognizing my own traumas and then how to respond to other people. Just learning what trauma was, was helpful and it was good, but being able to recognize it in myself and then in other people and then how to respond to it, that was a gold mine. So I hope that answers the question. If not, if you can reframe it, I'd be happy to address it.
Great, thank you. And Flower responded in the Q&A to just say, Dortell, thank you for your presentation and for sharing with us.
Yeah.
And we also have another question from Nakia. My question actually has to do with prevention, which you mentioned toward the end of your presentation. This may be difficult to answer, but do you think there's a way to translate what you've learned in your education to reach adolescents?
Absolutely. I think that, my problem started off in my adolescence. And I think that a lot of it had to do with the messages that I was receiving at home, the messages that I received from caregivers and teachers. What we say to children is, it can be a fulfilling prophecy. We can encourage them again, like I said, um, and help them to reach their fullest potential, or we can, humiliate them and denigrate them and tell them that they are worthless. And sometimes they will internalize that and they will fulfill that, fulfill those that labeling. So I think that when it comes to prevention, just simple things like just treating one another with care and dignity. True. When I was growing up, the saying was, don't speak to adults when you're not spoken to, and um, our ideas were often, thrown to the side, or we were treated like second class citizens. You guys don't know anything, just be quiet, and that type of thing. And children have a lot to offer, and I think that if we treat little human beings like little human beings, they'll respond, and we can help them to grow. And if I could, I don't want to turn this into a parenting class, but I think another thing that's really, really important is that when our children ask us questions, that we should do our best to entertain those questions, because when we don't, and I'll give you a couple of examples from when I was teaching, my peers in other classes. But when those ACEs, and I didn't get a chance to, I didn't explain the ACEs, but I'll give you a couple of examples of the numbers that Valenti was talking about, and those ACEs amount to basically you get a point for divorce. That's an ACE. You get a point for neglect. That's an ACE. You get a point for abuse. No matter what type of abuse it is, you get a point for that. And so those points, all these negative experiences, they add up. And the more of those that you have, of course, like I said, it adds up to negative outcomes. And so when life happens, we can't protect our children from every incident that is possible. And so, for instance, if a divorce occurs and we don't explain it to our children, then they will come up with their own interpretations. And like I was explaining with the mom who's working 2 or 3 jobs, and she's not explaining to the child why she's working 2 or 3 jobs or why she's absent, and not assuring the child that she loves the child comes up with his own conclusion, and that is that I'm not loved. So he seeks love in the neighborhood, with bad company. And again, a really negative outcome. Same thing with divorce. I remember a really, really poignant story where one of my peers told me that, when his parents were divorced when he was really young, and he interpreted that as his fault. And he felt like it was, all the fights that they would have about custody and weekend visits and that type of thing, they were his fault. And he internalized that and couldn't cope with it and began to use drugs to cope and that type of thing. And it went bad. And next thing you know, he was in prison. And so when it comes to prevention, I think that just being cognizant of what we say to children is so very important, because a lot of times it starts verbally and ends up with really bad outcomes. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We have several more questions here. One is from an anonymous submitter. What challenges did you face as you learned about trauma and toxic masculinity? And how were the responses of other students in your class to those topics?
So I think, and I've been in prison for 36 years. So it's hard for me to try to generalize this for people outside, but I think just for males that are accustomed to toxic masculinity, to putting on that mask and trying to be tough, and which a lot of it is fear-based in the first place. But I think for us, just trying to normalize that type of environment, trying to normalize having the support with other people to be able to relate to other people who are going through the same transformation, which was great for us because we're all we basically grew up together. So a lot of us, when we were in these classes and we were learning these things and then trying to apply them, we reinforced it with one another. we became accountability partners to one another. And, we're all in the same space to practice and hold each other accountable. On the outside, I'm not really sure how that would work unless it was like a group of people who decided to do the same thing. Not saying that it's impossible, and not saying that that people necessarily have to be in prison. We don't want people to come to prison in the first place. So I don't want to say that people have to come to prison for that, but we have to create an environment. We have to create a safe space when we're teaching people these things to be able to, because you can't do it by yourself. And I think that's the bottom line, is that, and especially when you're trying to change the culture or go against the culture, you're going to need support. And the more people that do it, the more people that practice it, the more people that normalize it, the better for everyone. And just as a side note, when we started the BA program, thanks to Taffy and them and Dr. Roy and all of the teachers, the phenomenal teachers that came to the prison and taught us and actually modeled what effective and compassionate communications looks like. I lost my thought. But I just think that I'm sorry, I lost my thought, but I think it's really a good idea for people to be able to support one another and to be able to practice together. And we were able to do that. Oh, I'm sorry. The point was that, again, when we first started the inaugural bachelor's degree, the entire cohort was sentenced to life without. We all had life without. And on that particular yard, it was called the honor yard. And we had come together and all agreed that we were, not going to engage in any type of game membership. We weren't going to engage in any type of drug use or anything. And we supported that among one another. We all have made this agreement that this is the type of facility that we're going to try to create. And with that, with mutual support and the support of staff, we were able to do that. And it just, it was just one success after another. We were able to get the AA degrees. We were able to get the BA degrees. That culminated into the master's degree. And, everything that, anyone who had any particular expertise, they taught the next person. So if John was an artist, he would teach, 12 weeks of artwork. If I was a writer, I would teach 12 weeks of writing. And so for us, it was really, really easy because we were in an environment that was, that had agreed to do that. And we were ready for that. It wasn't forced on us or anything like that. We were ready for that. And I think that helped a lot. So I'm not really sure how much we could generalize that. We're trying to do it here at Mule Creek. And I guess we're going to see, but nevertheless, education can, it's always a win-win whenever we can educate ourselves, because I think that just in humanity overall, ignorance is our biggest enemy. And so, if we can defeat ignorance and teach one another, we can have a better society inside a prison or out.
Thank you. And I think it's a good thing to think about the significance of peer support and cultures of community that exist within education, and that those are really important things to have hand in hand. Thank you.
Yeah. And one more thing, and I think it's
Yeah.
also important. Like I said, when we were at Lancaster and we had the honor yard, we had the support of the staff. And here at Mule Creek, I'm new here, but I'm experiencing the support of the staff. And I think that no matter where we are, whether it's, in a high school and some student is desperately coming to a counselor and asking for guidance about college, I think that whatever the background that kid has, if he's asking for help, then we probably should entertain that. So I think support among the community is extremely important too. And it can't just be the individual. And if I think about it, just about every experience I've had where I've succeeded, it was because someone supported me. And likewise, I'll just bring this I'll just make the point about um, all the award shows we see. Whenever we see award shows, the person gets up and they just thank all this, this army of people that helped them. And I think that um, that can be translated to everyone. We all need support, and we all should support one another if we want to have a crime-free world, a dignified world, and a civil world. Yeah.
Thank you. We have two more questions here. The first is from Kenny. What advice would you give to youth impacted by gang culture who believe going to prison is a badge of honor?
Well, I would tell them, for one, that it's great that they're seeking some type of fraternity because we need one another. But I would I would ask them to question to themselves why they're really joining a gang, and think of alternatives. So, a lot of times the gangs are right there, and or I'll put it in a very nice way. I was invited to be in a gang a few times when I was young, and it just never appealed to me. I always wanted to think for myself. And I think that young kids can think for themselves and just think about the possibilities of what they can do, right? And I know that's very difficult because we don't have a lot of role models in our neighborhoods, but if they need help, try to find a teacher or someone that they can trust, even if it's just another peer that they can trust that seems to be going in the right direction, to ask them, ask for help or ask for direction. But really think twice about joining a gang, because a lot of us who end up in gangs, we end up in prison. We end up, unfortunately, we lose our lives, and there are so many different opportunities out there, and so much help if we just seek it. And so that's what I would tell the youth, is to think twice about it, think about the bigger world, the world beyond just the neighborhood. And for anybody who's in a gang or has been in a gang, a lot of them will tell you that the loyalty stopped at the prison gate for the most part, right? And even when we're on the outside and we're shooting at one another and that type of thing, you come to prison and we end up being cellmates, and having to make alliances with the person or the group on the outside who we thought was the enemy. So I think it's really, really important to just to step back and look at what the possibilities are, look at what you can be. And I tell you, if I can use myself as a model, I'm in prison and I've been able to accomplish what I've been able to accomplish because I learned to believe in myself. I had the support. And if I can do it, no matter what age you are, you can do it too. I promise.
Thank you. And we're at perfect timing here. We have one more question left and about 4 minutes. And this brings us back to communication studies specifically. This is from an anonymous submitter. As someone who's never taught, but may be teaching a communications class next year in CDCR, do you have any advice for me to provide an educational environment that is beneficial for the individual and the class as a whole?
Yeah, I think that I think when you go inside, it's important to just keep an open mind. If you can exhibit the type of empathy and compassion in your communications that I saw with the instructors that we had at Cal State LA, then you will be received, you will be appreciated, because you'll be such a contrast to the regular environment. But also, I think it's just really simple. What did they say? Be the person, be the person that we want to see in the world. Um, I don't think that's quite right, but I think you get the gist of what I'm saying. That's it. So I commend you for wanting to go into a prison. for having the courage to go into a prison, and I'm sure you'll succeed. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dortell. This has been just a fantastic presentation.
Thank
I
you.
learned a lot, and I'm walking away with a lot from this session, and I would imagine other attendees feel the same. Thank you so much for being here, taking the time to present and answer questions for us today. We're so excited to have you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the entire community and for specifically for hosting with the International Scholars Conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And for folks who are on the call, we'll be having the Expressive Arts Plenary in just about 15 minutes. And I really encourage you to join. Yesterday's session was very moving to be able to listen to some poems and see some artwork from incarcerated artists. So please join us in 15 minutes. You can find the link in the virtual lobby. And again, thank you, Dortell. It was great to have you, and we appreciate it so much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you. You guys have a good day.
You as well. Thank you, everyone.